The pen hovered in his hand, and a crooked smile tugged at his lips as if this moment was entertainment rather than the end of a marriage. The room was quiet, heavy with the kind of silence that presses against your chest, but he broke it with a laugh, sharp, dismissive, cruel. He mocked her softly at first, then louder, as if the divorce papers were a stage and humiliation was his final performance. He spoke about how she'd never amounted to anything without him, how she'd been nothing once she walked out that door. She didn't argue, she didn't cry. She simply watched, her hands folded, her eyes calm, in a way that unsettled him. He thought her silence meant defeat. He had no idea it was restraint. As the ink touched the paper, he leaned back, savoring his victory, unaware that every word he'd spoken was being remembered. Unaware that the woman he was ridiculing had carried a secret so carefully protected that even he, her husband, had never questioned it. He didn't know about the late-night phone calls she took in private, the security that quietly followed her at a distance, or the reason she never flinched when money was thrown in her face. He didn't know who her father really was, and he certainly didn't know that the man he had just insulted by proxy was one of the most powerful trillionaires in the world, a name that moved markets, governments, and lives with a single decision. Outside that office, a chain of events was already in motion. A black car idled at the curb. A phone vibrated with a single message sent, "It's done." What he believed was the end of her story was only the opening scene of his own reckoning. Because some secrets aren't meant to protect weakness, they protect timing. And as the final signature dried, the balance of power shifted in a way he could never undo. This isn't just a story about a divorce. It's about arrogance, silence, and the moment a man realizes far too late that he mocked the wrong woman. The courthouse hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where emotions were expected to be controlled and dignity carefully preserved. Yet nothing about this moment felt controlled. She sat at the far end of the bench, hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the marble floor as if it might open and swallow her whole. Across from her, he leaned back with an ease that felt deliberate, almost theatrical, one leg crossed over the other, a smug half-smile playing on his lips. To him, this wasn't a painful ending, was entertainment. When the clerk finally called their names, he stood first, straightening his jacket with exaggerated confidence. As they entered the small office where the papers lay waiting, he let out a short laugh, loud enough to sting. "Well," he said casually, glancing at her worn shoes and simple dress. "This didn't take long, did it?" She said nothing. Her silence only seemed to amuse him more. The lawyer slid the documents across the table, explaining the process in a neutral tone, but his voice faded into the background. All she could hear was the echo of her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears. Years of marriages, of quiet endurance, of swallowed words, of invisible bruises, had led to this moment. She reached for the pen with trembling fingers. That's when he leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to feel intimate and cruel. "You know," he smirked, "you really should be grateful I stayed as long as I did. Look at you, no family, no money, no future. I'm doing you a favor, letting you walk away." Her hand froze mid-air. The lawyer cleared his throat, uncomfortable, but said nothing. Encouraged by the silence, he continued, "I mean, honestly, where are you going to go? Back to that tiny apartment, or are you hoping someone will save you? He chuckled again. You married way above your level. Don't forget that. She finally looked up at him, her eyes steady but unreadable. For a split second, something flickered across her face. Not anger, not fear, but restraint. A kind of quiet control that he completely misread. Oh, he added, tapping the papers with his finger, and let's be clear after today, you're nothing. No name, no status, just a mistake, I corrected. The words hung heavy in the room. If he had been paying attention, if arrogance hadn't clouded his judgment, he might have noticed how calm she suddenly became, how her breathing slowed, how her shoulders straightened. She signed. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper was sharp, final. His smile widened as he grabbed the pen next. See? That wasn't so hard. He signed his name with a flourish, then leaned back, satisfied. Freedom, he announced, almost celebratory. For both of us, but especially for me. He stood up, already done with the moment, already imagining his life without her. As he turned toward the door, he tossed one last line over his shoulder. Don't bother calling. People like me don't look back. What he didn't see was the lawyer's expression, confused, uneasy. What he didn't hear was the quiet vibration of her phone in her purse. She didn't answer it. Not yet. Because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something he could never have imagined. As they walked out of the office, he strode ahead, confident, victorious, utterly unaware that the woman he had just mocked was not walking away empty-handed. He didn't know that her silence wasn't weakness. He didn't know that the life he thought he controlled had been a carefully constructed illusion. And most of all, he didn't know that somewhere, watching from a distance, was a man whose name never appeared in headlines, whose wealth was never listed in rankings, and whose power made billionaires look ordinary. A man who had just been informed that his daughter had been humiliated, and who never forgave insults. The meeting with the lawyers ended, but the tension followed her like a shadow as she stepped out of the conference room. Her husband walked ahead, phone pressed to his ear, already laughing, already acting as if the divorce papers were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. She noticed how easily he slipped back into arrogance. How quickly he forgot that just minutes earlier he had signed away a marriage he once swore would last forever. The mocking words he had thrown at her still echoed in her mind, each one sharp, deliberate, meant to remind her of her supposed insignificance. She sat alone in the waiting area, hands folded tightly in her lap, breathing slowly to steady herself. This was not how she had imagined this day would feel. She had expected pain, maybe anger, but what surprised her most was the calm settling deep within her chest. Not the calm of defeat, but the calm of certainty. The truth she carried was heavy, but it also felt like armor. For years, she had lived quietly, never mentioning where she came from, never explaining why she didn't care about luxury or status. She had loved him for who she thought he was, not for what he had or pretended to be. Her phone vibrated softly. One message, then another. She glanced at the screen, her heart tightening for a moment before relaxing again. The name that appeared was one she had hidden from this part of her life, a name that belonged to a world her husband never bothered to ask about. her father, the man she had chosen to keep out of her marriage, not out of shame, but out of a desire to live an honest, simple life. He had warned her once, gently, that some people only respect power when it is visible. She had smiled back then, believing love was enough. Outside, her husband leaned against his car, still talking loudly, still playing the role of the confident man who believed he had one. He glanced at her and smirked, lowering his phone just long enough to throw one last comment her way. Something about how she would struggle now, how she would finally understand her place without him. People nearby heard it. A few exchanged uncomfortable looks, but no one said anything. She met his eyes, expression unreadable, and for the first time he hesitated. Something in her calm unsettled him, though he couldn't understand why. She stood up and walked past him without a word. That silence irritated him more than any argument ever had. He followed, demanding a reaction, mocking her composure, reminding her of how generous he had been to let her go. Each word only confirmed what she already knew. The man she once loved had never truly seen her. Her phone rang again. This time, she answered. Her voice was steady, respectful, but there was warmth there too. She listened quietly as her father spoke, his tone calm yet firm, asking only one question. Was she ready? She closed her eyes briefly, memories flashing through her mind, childhood lessons about dignity, about knowing your worth even when the world tries to shrink you. She answered simply, yes. Her husband overheard just enough to scoff. He made a joke about her pretending to have powerful connections, about fairy tales and imaginary protectors. He laughed loudly, drawing attention again. But she didn't rise to it. She ended the call, slipped her phone back into her bag, and looked at him one last time. There was no anger in her gaze, no bitterness, only certainty. The kind that comes from knowing the truth will surface whether people are ready for it or not. He mistook her silence for weakness, never realizing that every step he took in arrogance was bringing him closer to a reality that would shatter everything he believed about power, money, and control. As she walked away, the air seemed to change. What he thought was the end of her story was only the beginning. And somewhere beyond the parking lot, beyond the mocking laughter and signed papers, forces he could not imagine were already moving. The next morning was heavy with tension, the kind that makes the air feel thick and every sound echo louder than it should. The night before, everything had shifted his arrogance. His mocking words while signing the divorce papers and her calm, measured responses now replayed in my mind like a slow, haunting melody. I could see her father's name in bold letters on the documents, yet the reality of it didn't fully settle until I watched the way her expression remained steady, almost unreadable, as if she carried a secret shield that he could never penetrate. The scene at the office had been unforgettable. He had leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing across his face, believing that victory was his. She had offered nothing but polite acknowledgement, her hands folded neatly, her eyes level with his. Every sarcastic comment he made was met with a silence so profound that it seemed to press against the walls of the room. It was in that quiet defiance that the first seeds of unease had begun to take root in him, though he had yet to realize the magnitude of what he had provoked. Later that day, the realization began to dawn as his phone buzzed incessantly. Messages, calls, and notifications flooded in. each one hinting at the network and influence that had quietly surrounded her all along. He had underestimated the depth of her connections, the hidden power in the bloodline he had ridiculed. With each incoming alert, a faint shadow crossed his confident expression, the first cracks in his carefully maintained arrogance. She, meanwhile, moved with a grace and composure that seemed almost untouchable, untouched by his prior cruelty. We followed her as she returned home, the streets quiet around her, the early morning sunlight beginning to filter through the city's skyline. It was a world she had navigated long before him, a realm of privilege and protection that he could never imagine. As she entered her home, her father appeared, not with fanfare, but with a quiet authority that seemed to fill every corner of the room. The air shifted again, heavy with the power he had mocked unknowingly, and suddenly the dynamic had reversed. The scales of influence, of respect and fear were no longer in his favor. I watched him as the messages continued to arrive, the reality sinking in slowly yet relentlessly. He had assumed superiority, belittled her intelligence, and dismissed her entirely. But the truth was unfolding like a storm, an unstoppable force that had been quietly waiting, building momentum while he remained blind to it. Every confident grin began to fade, replaced with tension, hesitation, and a growing sense of dread. It was almost poetic years of arrogance confronting a reality he could neither ignore nor control. She stood silently beside her father, a figure of poise and quiet authority. Her earlier mockery of his actions now seemed a distant memory compared to the full weight of her family's presence. The contrast between what he had assumed and what was actually true could not have been more stark. In that moment, I could almost feel the air shift around him. The invisible power of legacy and wealth pressing down like a tide, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in ways he had never anticipated. By the afternoon, he was forced to confront the reality he had ignored for far too long: calls from lawyers, the sudden interest of the media, and whispers of influence began to tighten around him, and I could see the fear in his eyes, subtle yet undeniable. He had mocked, underestimated, and scorned, but now the consequences of his ignorance were unfolding with precision. She watched quietly, a subtle smile hinting at satisfaction, the calm before the storm fully settled into place. The lesson was being delivered in real time. Arrogance, when faced with unseen power, meets an inevitable reckoning. The tension lingered into the evening, a sense of inevitability hanging like a cloud. Every movement he made, every attempt to assert control, felt futile against the quiet authority of her presence and her father's unspoken dominance. She had mastered patience, strategy, and restraint, leaving him exposed in the most human way possible through his own hubris. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the city in gold and shadows, it was clear that the power dynamic had shifted completely, irrevocably, and with consequences he could never have foreseen. The morning after the tension-filled revelations brought a strange, almost surreal calm to the city. He woke to a world that seemed unchanged, yet everything had shifted beneath him. The arrogance that had carried him through years of superiority now felt hollow, like a fragile mask that had been cracked and could not be mended. Every phone notification, every whisper in the office corridors, reminded him that the balance of power had tilted completely. He could no longer dismiss her, nor the influence that had been silently shaping events around him. Her father, a figure whose wealth and authority had remained a closely guarded secret, now loomed in every corner of his life. The realization that he had mocked the daughter of a trillionaire, the same woman he had belittled, gnawed at him relentlessly. Meetings he once dominated now carried an undercurrent of scrutiny, subtle but unavoidable. Each glance from colleagues, each unexpected phone call, reinforced that his earlier confidence had been naive, bordering on reckless. The irony of the situation was inescapable. The man who had believed himself untouchable was now vulnerable, exposed, and increasingly frantic. She, meanwhile, moved with an elegance that belied the storm she had unleashed. Her composure was meticulous, each word measured, each gesture controlled. And yet every action radiated the quiet power of someone who knew the depths of influence surrounding her. She did not need to raise her voice or confront him directly. Her presence alone, bolstered by the unseen force of her father, was enough to shift the room. It was a lesson in restraint and strategy, showing that power is often quiet, patient, and unyielding, unlike arrogance, which crumbles under scrutiny. By mid-afternoon, he was confronted with the tangible manifestations of the truth he had ignored. Messages from high-powered contacts, discreet inquiries, and sudden requests for clarification began to infiltrate his carefully controlled life. Every move was scrutinized, every decision questioned, and for the first time, he realized that his mockery had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. The weight of humiliation began to settle in, an almost physical pressure that made even mundane tasks seem difficult. He had underestimated the invisible network supporting her, a legacy of wealth and influence that was now fully active. She watched him from a distance, her expression calm but observant. The faint curve of her lips suggested a satisfaction that was quiet yet profound. It was the satisfaction of someone who had known the truth all along, someone who had waited patiently for the moment to arrive. Her father's presence, though subtle, reinforced this tension, an invisible anchor of authority that made every attempt at control on his part seem inconsequential. He had entered the situation believing in his dominance, yet he was now navigating a landscape designed to humble him completely. As evening approached, the full extent of the consequences became unavoidable. He received calls from lawyers, unexpected inquiries from business associates, and even subtle media attention. Each interaction chipped away at the confidence he had once wielded effortlessly. Meanwhile, she remained poised, a master of calculated restraint, demonstrating that true power is not loud or aggressive, but deliberate and unshakable. The irony was almost poetic. His mockery had set into motion events that now dictated his every step, leaving him a spectator to the influence he had so carelessly dismissed. By nightfall, the atmosphere was charged with quiet intensity. The realization had fully sunk in. He had underestimated her, belittled her, and mocked her, but the reality of her family's power was undeniable. He could no longer control the narrative. It had been seized by forces he had never seen, and the consequences were irreversible. She, standing with the calm assurance of someone fully aware of her position, had turned the tables without a single raised voice. And in that silence, heavy with unspoken authority and consequence, the lesson was clear. Arrogance, when met with unseen power and patience, will always falter. His world had been upended not by confrontation, but by restraint, strategy, and the quiet weight of influence. The stage was set for the inevitable reckoning, and the truth could no longer be hidden or denied. If you want, I can continue Chapter 5 next, where the emotional climax and confrontation happen, keeping the cinematic and suspenseful style consistent. The reckoning had finally come. What began as arrogance, mockery, and careless dismissal had transformed into a profound lesson in humility, respect, and the invisible power of influence. He had entered the situation believing himself untouchable, only to discover that true authority does not shout, it waits, observes, and moves with quiet precision. She had shown restraint, poise, and patience, revealing that strength is measured not by words or pride, but by composure, strategy, and the bonds that support you. As the dust settled, the world felt different for everyone involved. For him, it was a humbling confrontation with reality. For her, it was validation of her dignity and the security that comes from being protected by those who care and hold true power. And for anyone watching, the story serves as a timeless reminder. Arrogance has a price, patience has power, and respect is earned, never assumed. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the strength of quiet resilience, subscribe to our channel for more emotional, real-life stories. Like this video to show support. Share it with friends or family who need a reminder that patience and dignity triumph over mockery. And comment below, what would you have done if you were in her shoes? Stay tuned for more stories that inspire, uplift, and reveal the human spirit in all its strength and vulnerability. Every story has a lesson. Make sure you don't miss the next one.